you ever looked at a spot in a solver and found that basically every hand in your range is taking various different actions at different frequencies? These spots can be very confusing. So if you're struggling with interpreting these situations, this video is for you. Hi Wizards, I'm Matt Hunt, and today we're going to talk about the truth about mixed strategies. Now let's start with a very simple question, which is, what is a mixed strategy? Well, the best way to answer this is to actually talk about what a mixed strategy isn't, because there are a lot of misconceptions that exist here. First and foremost, a mixed strategy is not playing the same hand different ways in different circumstances. You'll hear this quite often. You'll hear players say something like, well, against Joe, I would 3-bet this hand, but against Steve, I think flatting is better. And that right there is not a mixed strategy, for the reasons that we'll explain in just a second. That is not something that we would classify as being a mix, because essentially it's two different strategies. It's two different spots, two different situations, two different approaches with a specific hand. Similarly, if a player is saying something along the lines of, if stacks were deeper, I would call, but at this stack size, I think folding is better. That is also not a mixed strategy. Once again, that is two separate strategies for two separate spots. So it's very important that when we start to think about and talk about mixed strategies, we employ the term in the right way, and we don't start discussing concepts that actually are pretty much completely different from mixed strategies. When we're talking about more than one different approach being viable for a hand based on circumstances, well, that's not a mixed strategy, that's really an exploitative strategy. And we're getting into a completely different realm if we start talking about that. So let's start thinking about the reality of what a mixed strategy actually is. Well, essentially, it comes down to the idea of randomization. A mixed strategy is a strategy where we are randomizing our action in a specific circumstance, specific situation, in one of a few different ways. There are many different ways that you can randomize. You can use something like an environmental factor around you, like the tournament clock if you're playing a tournament. You can look at the last digit on the tournament clock and say, if it's between 0 and 4, I'm going to do this. If it's between 5 and 9, I'm going to do something else. There are various different ways that you can do this. You can use looking at your chips and seeing which way the chip at the top of your stack is aligned. If you're playing online, you can use the clock on your computer. All sorts of things you can do to use randomization as part of your strategy. And anytime you're using this randomization, you're employing a mixed strategy. Anytime you're doing the opposite, where you're choosing one option ahead of another, that means you are employing a pure strategy. So ultimately, these are two completely different, contrasting things. We're either randomizing or we're not randomizing. So the question becomes then, why would we randomize our actions? Why would we want to essentially give up control over our action and hand it over to a random factor? Well, there are a few reasons, but the easiest way to understand why we might do this is to start by understanding why the solver does it. Well, the solver does it because it needs to remain unexploitable in all aspects of its strategy. In the solver, it's playing against a perfect opponent. It's trying to ensure that every part of its strategy, every range that it has, is going to include strong hands, bluff catchers, bluffing candidates, and so on, across all possible betting lines, to avoid being exploited, or, in other words, allowing our opponent to make a deviation that improves their EV. So it's essentially just trying to maximize its EV, but it's playing against itself. It's playing against a perfect opponent that can spot any weakness, and therefore it understands that it has to figure out a way to make every part of the strategy coherent and to make it functional by including different types of hands that have different functionality and can achieve different things. So now that we've covered why the solver might randomize, let's talk about when this is actually going to happen. In what circumstances is this going to happen? Well, generally, it's going to be any time the EV of two actions is essentially the same. So it's going to be situations where both calling and raising, for example, have the same EV against a perfect opponent, or where calling and folding have the same EV, folding being 0 and calling also being 0. Essentially, It's in any circumstance where it doesn't matter what we do in each individual instance. However, over time, if we always took the same action in these spots, that strategy would become exploitable. If we take every bluff catcher in a river spot and we essentially fold it all the time, then ultimately we end up folding at a pretty high frequency. And it becomes much more straightforward for our opponent to identify that they can exploit this tendency. They benefit from us overfolding in this instance. So we generally are going to see that when the solver's doing this, it's because this is an area where a hole in our strategy, an exploitable aspect of our strategy, could exist if we simply did the same thing every time. So that's why this exists. That's why this happens. Now, I'm going to take a quick look at a spot that I've prepared, which is an example of a mixed strategy. It's relatively simple, pretty straightforward, but hopefully it'll illustrate the concept pretty well. So this is our example spot right here. It's actually a very straightforward cash game scenario. We are at no limit 500, 2.5x open from the hijack, and we're on the button. And as you can see, there's a lot of hands here that are featuring a mixed strategy. In fact, almost all the hands that are putting money in to any degree are mixing at a pretty significant frequency. The only hands that are playing a certain action purely are aces, ace-king, and kings. That's it. Even queens is not taking the same action 100% of the time. Ace-queen suited, 97% of the time it's 3-betting, but 3% of the time it's flatting, and so on. You could look through the entire rest of the range, and there are no hands other than the folding hands that are taking a certain action purely. Even fives and below, they're mixing calls and folds. In this circumstance, this is a great example of mixed strategies in action. If I click on the EVs for each hand over here, and then we convert it to percentage of pot, you'll see obviously all the hands that are playing pretty much pure fold are making 0% of pot, of course. But then if we look at the hands that are calling, you can see that a lot of them, the ones that are taking a call option at a pretty low frequency, are making almost exactly zero. 9-8 suited, for example, exactly 0% of pot. 10-9 suited, very slightly more than that, and so on. There's a few hands over here that are making 0% of pot. There's a few hands up here, and so on. So all these hands that are mixing between call and fold are doing it because the EVs are the same. Same goes for 3-betting. If we highlight 3-betting, you can see these hands once again are falling into that category where the EV of raising, you can tell from this graphic, is 0% of pot. We're looking at all this stuff here, pretty close to zero. A lot of this stuff down here, pretty close to zero. All this stuff, pretty close to zero, and so on. So obviously, even though there is a tiny margin for error in the actual sims themselves, the solver doesn't calculate to the most precise degree of accuracy in every single case. There's usually going to be some scope there for some slight inaccuracy. So for the most part here, you can see that because the EV is close together, or the EV is in fact exactly the same, the solver is choosing to mix. And if we go back to the baseline strategy, you can see that there's a lot of hands here where it's pretty close between 3-bet and call. You can see all of this stuff right here is really never folding at all, but it's definitely not sure whether it should flat or 3-bet. And that's reflective of the fact that we need board coverage in both of these ranges. So ultimately, this strategy will come up quite a lot. You'll see mixing coming up quite often in these preflop spots. And in essence, it's because we need to have the right kind of a 3-bet range to attack the original raiser here, but we also need to have the right kind of a flatting range so that we don't get attacked by the players left to act behind in these cases as well. So there's a variety of things that we're trying to balance up against each other here to create a well-rounded strategy. And that's where we're trying to get to with our ultimate outcome here. So that's the basics of why these mixed strategies exist in these spots. We're trying to protect our ranges from all possible angles. But of course, the big question now is, do we actually need to mix in practice? And unfortunately, the short answer is maybe, because it's true that there will rarely be instances where your opponent can specifically make adaptations based on knowing that you are never mixing in a certain spot. But the impact of never mixing on later street nodes in the game tree can be quite significant. So it's going to quite often affect the way that turns and rivers are going to play out if you don't mix a certain hand on an earlier street. And we call this the downstream impact. The impact that a decision has on everything that comes after that decision point. It has a big impact on subsequent nodes in the decision tree. And I can illustrate this with a spot that I picked out from a cash game scenario where we're just playing a chip EV circumstance and we have a board come out that requires a lot of mixed strategies with various types of hands. It's an 8-7-4 flush draw board. So let's take a look at that. So here's our spot that we're looking at. As I mentioned, it's a 100 big blind cash game spot, chip EV ranges, very basic, straightforward situation, probably replicating a timed rake live game, let's say, using these chip EV ranges. And we're in low jack against big blind formation, 5.5 bigs in the pot after we opened a 2.5x. Big blind calls, we go to a flop, and we get this 8-7-4 two spades flop. Now, I have removed the big blind's donk bet range here, just to simplify the sim a little bit and allow us to work a little bit more straightforwardly by looking at what we're doing against a pure check strategy, not complicating things by introducing different variables about what the donk bet size is and things like that. And you can see that our bet strategy here basically employs this 40% of pot sizing, and it's not betting at a very high frequency here either. We're betting about 40% of the time. Now, that's just simply because this is not a great board for in position. It's a board where if we allowed the big blind to donk bet, they would be doing it quite a bit. They have a pretty strong range here. So naturally, in position isn't going to be able to be super aggressive. But the interesting factor is, of course, there are a lot of mixed strategies going on, as you can see. Now, the best way to get a grip on this is to look at the filters on the right-hand side. As you take a look at the equity buckets, you can very clearly see that there's no bucket of hands here that is heavily favoring betting. And there's no bucket that's heavily favoring checking. We're a little bit more inclined to check with the weak hands, you can see right there. But ultimately, every category of hands is betting and checking at a decent frequency here, even if you break it down in a more granular way. There is a little bit of linearity to the betting range. You can see where the cutoff points are there. But even the weakest hands are still betting a decent chunk of the time. And only the exact nuts, 6-5, is betting at 100% frequency here. Same goes for all the categories of draws. It's kind of splitting 50-50 on average. And if you look at this construction here, little bit of polarity if you look at hand categories. But again, in general, we're mostly seeing a range where there's a lot of mixing going on and no specific category of hands is heavily favoring betting or checking. Now, what this does is it creates a circumstance where, let's say when we check back, we still have plenty of potential hands that can be strong in our checking back range. There are hands like, if we filter for the top of our range, aces and kings that are checking back this flop a good amount. Queens is not checking, but that's because most of the combos of queens are not in the best hands category that we just highlighted. We've even got some sets, some two pair that's checking back. In fact, all of our 8-7 is checking back. So we've got a pretty well protected checking back range. On top of that, we've also got a bunch of flush draws. We look at nut flush draws, and combo draws. Our flush draws are only betting about 60% of the time on the whole here. So clearly when it goes check, check, and the turn is a spade, we're going to be able to have a flush quite often. And as you can see on this jack of spades turn, we do now have a flush approximately 5% of the time. Not a huge frequency, but it's decent. It's enough to protect our range to some degree. So our next step is now to see what happens if we decide not to take that mixed strategy on the flop. What happens if we play this spot differently? Well, right now, when we get to this jack of spades turn, our EV share is 48.58% of the pot, which is not bad. Just under half the pot. We check back the flop, we still win about half the pot. It's pretty good. But let's see what happens if we decide to lock our flop strategy. And in this case, we maybe decide that on the flop, we are going to just always bet every single straight, set, and two pair. And we're going to always bet all of our combos, flush draws, and nut flush draws. So ultimately, everything that is a strong draw, flush draw plus, is going to bet this flop. And we're actually also going to throw the open-enders in there just for good measure. 10-9, people tend to bet a lot of open-enders here. So we're betting all combo draws, flush draws, and nut flush draws. And now we're just going to lock. So we're going to basically say, We're still playing everything else completely optimally, still playing a perfect strategy with the rest of our range, but we're just betting all of our strongest hands at 100% frequency. See what impact this has now. Previously, our opponent was able to bet that jack of spades turn about 75% of pot, and they weren't betting that often. But now when it goes check, check, and we get that jack of spades turn, see what happens. Take a look at this. They're able to bet 2.5x the pot. They're just using a geometric size, 2.5x pot, 2e size, with more than half of their range. They are just applying insane amounts of pressure here because our range is completely capped. And take a look at our EV share of the pot. It's gone down from 48.5% to 28%, less than 28%. We've cost ourselves about 20% of this pot by never checking back a flush draw and never checking back two pair plus. It's a huge deficit. Now, it's not necessarily, of course, going to be the case that our opponent is immediately able to realize that this is exactly what we're doing. But as you'll see in a second, it's not as complex as you might think for them to figure this out. So let's talk about it a little bit. So like I say, you're probably asking right now, surely my opponents are never going to figure this out. Well, unfortunately for us, they don't have to. And what this comes down to is you're probably spending a lot of time thinking about how your opponents perceive your game. And a lot of players spend too much time thinking about this because your opponents aren't going to have enough information about you to make specific adjustments. You're right about that. You're right that it's very difficult for them to know that you specifically are doing exactly this in this spot. However, the better players that you're playing against will have a pretty good, solid understanding of how the average player in that player pool is going to play a specific spot. And that becomes a problem for us because if that's the case, and here's why. Even though it's true that even your toughest opponents don't know your game well enough to identify your specific weaknesses, they do know the weaknesses of the player pool. And if your weaknesses match the weaknesses of the player pool, then the way that your opponents play a certain spot by default, based on their assumptions and their understanding about how their player pool tends to play, is going to essentially be exactly how they need to play in order to exploit you individually. And that's where things start to become really problematic. Because now your opponents are not even going to have to know anything about you specifically. All they're going to have to do is have a broad understanding of how the player pool plays and how to adjust to that. And it's not that difficult for a good player to recognize that if you check back the flop and you never have a flush on a flush card turn, they can apply a ton of pressure to that range. So what it comes down to is that the best way to avoid getting exploited by the better players in your player pool is to simply make sure that whatever weaknesses do exist in your game are not the same weaknesses as what exists in the rest of your player pool. You don't want to be making the same mistakes as everybody else. It's okay to make mistakes, especially if those mistakes are very difficult for your opponents to figure out. But if you're making the same mistakes as everybody else does, that's where it becomes a real problem. So you might be now wondering, well, does that mean I should start randomizing all the time? Well, the answer is no, because there is a way out of this dilemma. While it's true that mixing at the range level is crucial, because obviously we can't just range bet or range check every single spot, and mixing at the hand class level, so different categories of hands, is also very important because it helps to protect our ranges and moderate bluffing tendencies in the different ways that we've talked about. Mixing at the individual hand combination level is usually not very important at all, as long as we understand how the other levels function, as long as we understand approximately how aggressive we're going to be, and we understand that different hand categories are going to have different preferences, that we have to have a variety of hands in our range that exist across different categories. As long as we understand those things, we don't generally have to employ a mixed strategy with individual hands very often. Or to put this another way, what it comes down to is this simple statement. If you understand the properties of individual hand combinations and the function of specific bet sizings, you will very rarely need to actively randomize. I'm not going to say never, because of course there are spots where you might be up against tough players. Randomizing can be useful, of course. But you will very rarely need to actively randomize, if you understand the function of bet sizings and the properties of different hand combinations. So let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to look at this same example, same one we just looked at, and we're going to illustrate a range that is not mixing at all, but it's selecting hands purely on the individual hand combo level. So we're back to our same sim as we just had. And in this case, what I've done is I've taken about 5-10 minutes, not a huge amount of time. Haven't gone through this in incredible detail, but I've taken some time to flesh out a strategy and a construction for our range here that doesn't involve ever doing any mixing with any hand candidate. So as you can see, the frequencies are fairly similar to what they were before. The frequencies here are at about 40%, 43% in this case. Sizing is the same. And by contrast, if we look at the summary of all the hands and we flip through here, every single hand, if we scroll all the way down, is either purely checking or purely betting. There's no hand that has a bit of red and a bit of green here, right? So every single combination of hand is playing a pure strategy. But the entire range is constructed in such a way that, if you look at the categories, they still resemble somewhat what we saw before. There's a little bit of difference here in this grouping. There's a little bit kind of a different shape here, and still a little bit of linearity there. There are certain combinations of draws that are betting more often. You can see we got the flush draws and the open-enders betting a little bit more frequently. So there's certain tweaks that maybe if you wanted to go into even more granular detail, you could really pick out the specifics here and get this 100% accurate. But even in just 5 or 10 minutes of building out this strategy, we have arrived at a similar frequency and a decent range construction. And if we look at where we're at in terms of EV on the flop, we're still outperforming villain on the flop. We've got 53.4% of pot EV share here. So on the flop, we're doing fine. And crucially, when we look at that jack of spades turn, we are no longer getting absolutely wrecked by these massive bets. We're making about 43% of pot, and villain is only able to use a 40% size. They're not able to use this massive polarized geometric size here. So even though we are still about 5% of pot shy of where we would like to get to here, our optimal pot share, we are doing significantly better than the strategy where we just took an optimal strategy but always bet our strongest hands in our draws. And this didn't even take that much effort. It took 5 or 10 minutes, like I say. Now, I'm not suggesting that you guys can do this without effort. Of course, it takes time to get good at selecting the hands that we're picking. But if you understand the properties of different hands and you understand the function of bet sizes, you can do this. You can learn to get good at this. One of the factors that I use to help select the betting range here is simply suit interactions. So for example, offsuit hands that have a spade in them, we're betting a lot of those, right? Offsuit hands that don't have a spade in them, we're betting far fewer of those. That's definitely going to be a factor here that you'll see even in the baseline solution. Suited hands, of course, we're not betting all of our flush draws. We're betting a lot of our backdoors, but not all of our backdoors. And we're betting a lot less often if we have diamonds or clubs. Those factors are going to be very relevant as well. So again, it's not a perfect metric, but it's a very good one, and it gets you pretty close to a good strategy without the need for any actual randomization. So you might be left thinking, well, how do I actually get better at this? Because this is a very complex process. Well, in this case, the range builder on GTO Wizard is your best friend. The range builder is a really, really great tool. You can use it to practice building some very robust strategies which don't involve any mixing, or maybe you use it for employing some strategies which have a simple 50-50 mix on certain hands. That's certainly an element you can add in if you feel like it's useful or necessary. And remember also that you can use the range builder in conjunction with node locking. This is really crucial. You can node lock a sim and then skip yourself out of looking at the answers, essentially, and go through a range construction exercise. You can node lock how you're going to construct your range against a specific type of opponent. You can build a robust strategy that doesn't require mixing, designed to cater to a specific tendency that your opponent might have. There's all sorts of things you can do. But in general, as you can tell, if you are mixing at the right levels, if you're mixing at the hand class level, if you're mixing at the range level, you don't actually have to necessarily mix at the specific combo level that often. So hopefully this video has given you a little bit of a guide of how you might want to start incorporating mixed strategies or why they might be useful. And it's also reassured you that there aren't going to be very many situations where you're going to need to randomize and leave your strategy up to variance in most scenarios. So thanks everybody for watching. And if you'd like to check out another video, I have one right here that I recently made where we talked about the situations where you should not use a mixed strategy. And in fact, you should range bet. You should bet every single hand. So if you want to check that video out, the link is right here. Otherwise, if you have any questions, I'll be available on Discord and you can tag me and ask your questions right there. Until next time, everyone, thanks for watching and good luck, Wizards.